Since 1887, the Stonington Free Library has been a center for knowledge, ideas, creativity, and entertainment. It is a comfortable and welcoming community space for the town of Stonington, Connecticut, where all ages can explore, discover, gather, and learn within a building of distinctive and unique architecture. This video program is an evolution to expand the offerings of the library to share directly in your home or organization. Welcome to the Sunday evening lecture series made available to you by the Stonington Free Library.
Can you hear me? My name is Jody Bump, and I'm a member of the Library Program Committee, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this, what's turning out to be actually a nice afternoon. This is our Sunday night speaker series given by the Stonington Free Library, and of course this venue is fabulous, and we're so grateful to the LaGrua Center for hosting us for these special events. So I think a round of applause for the LaGrua Center. And it's my honor to introduce our speaker, Lily King, who is author of the award-winning novel Euphoria, which I believe many of you have probably read, and some of you are going to be reading as book clubs pick it up. Lily grew up in Massachusetts and received her BA in English Literature from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and her MA in Creative Writing from Syracuse University. She has taught English and creative writing at several universities and high schools in this country and abroad. Lily's novels have won numerous prestigious awards and accolades and include The Pleasing Hour, The English Teacher, and Father of the Ring. Her latest novel, Euphoria, was released in June 2014 and is loosely based on the life of the anthropologist Margaret Mead and her work in New Guinea. The book has won the Kirkus Award for Fiction 2014, the New England Book Award for Fiction in 2014, and was a finalist in the National Book Critics Circle Award. Euphoria was also named one of the 10 best books of 2014 by the New York Times Book Review, was included in Time Magazine's list of the top 10 fiction books of 2014, and was one of Amazon's best books of 2014. The novel is being translated into numerous languages, and a movie is underway, so stay tuned on that. Hopefully Lily can share some of that news. On a local note, many of you know Lily's mother-in-law, Harriet Ballard, and there she is over there, who lives here in the borough. I know it's been a great source of support for Lily in her career. Copies of the book will be available for purchase at the table in the back. Wonderful Bank Square Books folks are here, and Lily has kindly agreed to sign the books. So please join me in welcoming Lily to our Stonington Free Library Sunday Night Speaker Series. Lily?
Hi. Thank you so much for coming out on this really, really gorgeous afternoon. I'm grateful. And it's always such a delight to come to Stonington. We've been coming here now for, I think, almost 8 years. And so I have to thank my mother-in-law, Harriet Ballard, and Derek Nicholas so much for always welcoming us here, and for also, I think, probably bullying a lot of you guys into buying my book and reading my book in the past couple of years. And I'm grateful so much to them, and also to Derek's 4 sons who have been so supportive and so kind to me and my family. I just feel like you all have a really, really special community here, and I'm so glad to be here today. Thank you to the Stonington Free Library for inviting me, Susan Martin, who made the connection, and to Jody, who's been wonderful in setting it up. I thought that I would start out by talking a little bit about how I got the idea for this book, and then how it went from the idea to the finished product, because that's really the thing I always want to know when I go hear writers. Even though I've done this before, it's still a little bit of a mystery to me how it gets done. And I'm now at the very beginning of a book again, and it feels like I've never done it before. So it's I don't know, maybe reassuring to talk about that in some way. So this is my fourth novel, and when I was at the very, very beginning of my third novel, Father of the Rain, a friend of mine, we had just moved to Maine a couple of years before that, and a new friend of mine came to my house and said, I'm going to take you to my favorite bookstore. And so I got in her car, went to her favorite bookstore, and it was closing, and there were closeout signs all over the place, and there was hardly anything to buy. And I felt like I had to get something because she had, made the effort to take me there, knowing that I loved books like she did. And so I looked around and there were a lot of old cookbooks, and there was like Carl Sagan. I just couldn't find anything that I would want to read. And then finally I found this old beat-up hardcover biography written in, I think, 78 or 80 or something like that, about Margaret Mead, called Margaret Mead, A Life. And I thought, okay, I'll pick this up. I'll probably never read it, but, at least it's something. And so I went home with my little Margaret Mead biography, threw it by my bed, thinking that I would never see it again. And I don't know why exactly, but a few days later I picked it up. And I honestly didn't really know a whole lot about Margaret Mead. I mean, I knew about coming of age in Samoa. I think maybe I had read part of that once upon a time. But when this book came out, one of my first reviews was from the San Francisco Chronicle, and this woman, Joan Frank, wrote that she too had this image of Margaret Mead, and that was kind of it. And it was that she was a doughy, dotty brain box, kin in warbles and waddles to Julia Child and Eleanor Roosevelt. That was really, really pretty much my idea of Margaret Mead too. And then I read this book. And she was, it starts out when she was young. And the book, it was a much better, how sometimes you buy biographies and you really want to know about the person, but it starts with the grandparents and you have to go through about 200 pages before you get to the subject that you actually bought the book for. And this book starts off right away. We go right into Margaret Mead's life. It moves fast. It's interesting. And then you get to chapter 11, I believe it was, and it's a very short chapter because there wasn't really a lot of information about this time in her life. But she was 31 years old, and it was the end of 1932. She had been doing her really kind of her second big field trip with her, and it's her first field trip, or her first major field trip with her second husband. And they are in Papua New Guinea, and they've been there for a year, and things are not going well. It turns out he's very difficult to work with. He thinks she's very difficult to work with. They are very isolated and alone. They've been up a mountain for a year, very isolated and a stressful time, and then they came down and they went to a pretty violent tribe on the Sepik River, and they finally decided, we gotta hightail it out of here. We gotta go to Australia. And right before they left for Australia, they decided, all right, well, let's just stop by and see this other English anthropologist, Gregory Bateson. And they had been kind of avoiding Bateson because he was studying the Iatmal right there, and they were kind of a big warrior tribe, and they didn't want to get in his way. They didn't want to feel him to feel that they were encroaching. And her husband, Rayo Fortune, knew Bateson, but she had never met him. And then they decided, okay, well, let's just go. We're going to Australia. We'll just go high and by, and we'll get out of here. And they went, and Margaret Mead writes in her memoir that I read later that they met and they talked for 30. Her husband immediately got very, very drunk and kind of, averbal. But she and Gregory Bateson talked for 36 hours straight, and she fell madly in love with him. And so he said, don't go to Australia. Stay here. He had been very, very depressed. It had not been going well for him either. He just felt completely alone, and he wanted a partner. He wanted people around him, other anthropologists. He hadn't seen another anthropologist in 2 years. And so he said, I'll find you a tribe nearby, stay. And so he took them up, and they found a tribe. And he had a little house built right near, and so he would go back and forth to this little house. And then apparently somebody interviewed at one point a canoe boy who rowed back and forth between Bateson's little house nearby and Margaret Mead's house. Apparently he said he was going back and forth morning, noon, and night, passing notes back and forth between them. And so, you know, they were in this really difficult love triangle situation with her husband getting more and more jealous and more frustrated, and Mead and Gregory Bateson falling more and more in love. And, you know, they were having malarial fevers, they were having these, you know, very, very intense conversations about anthropology, all three of them, or just two of them, and then they had this, all three of them together had this big breakthrough. They thought it was a big breakthrough, and then they cabled back and they said, you know, we're coming back, we've had a breakthrough, but then that all broke down as well, and they all came back separately to different countries. Anyway, I read this very short chapter with all of that happening, and I thought, wow, that's kind of an interesting story. You know, somebody should write a novel about that. But thinking, you know, it's not going to be me. I write novels about people, you know, who live in houses with running water and toilets and that sort of thing. It just wasn't. I don't read historical fiction. I don't write about things that have happened. I'm not interested in kind of, I don't know, bringing famous dead people back to life in scenes like that. Is just was not my interest at all in fiction. And I had never been to Papua New Guinea, and I really had no plans to go. I had little children. It just seemed all wrong for me. So, you know, I kept reading, and I finished the biography, and then I went back to my other novel, Father of the Rain, which was going very slowly. And it would kind of come out in a big rush, and then I would have to stop. It was a very intense novel to write, and it would make me kind of emotional, and it would kind of bring me down. And I had these little kids, and I couldn't go that far down, so I would just stop. And I didn't have anything else to do, so I went around kind of reading about Margaret Mead. And I read Coming of Age in Samoa, and I read the book Sex and Temperament that she wrote about these three tribes that she had studied in between 31 and 33 in Papua New Guinea. And I just, I bought a notebook, started taking notes, and I would get a detail. For example, you know, she made bread with crocodile eggs. And then I would kind of see a scene. I would see the little kitchen. I'd kind of see how they were living, and I would, you know, write down some dialogue and some description, and then I would go back to Father of the Rain. I'd write some more, and I'd go back, and you know, I felt like I was kind of sneaking around on my other novel with Margaret Mead. But and I think really all of that was the book sort of evolved from a collaboration between the research I was doing and my own imagination. And I didn't really stop myself from making things up and saying, wow, they could do this or they could do that. I mean, on one hand, I wanted to tell this story about Margaret Mead, but on the other hand, I was a novelist, and I wasn't going to stop myself for having better ideas than real life. If I do say so myself. And so I remember in about 2009, I got 4 sentences, and I wrote them down in the back of the notebook, and they were really the first 4 sentences of this book, and they kind of made me feel like after all that research, I could hear the voice of the novel. But I didn't write anything more until I think 2011, at the beginning of 2011. Then Father of the Ring was out, and I'd gone on a book tour for that, and then I was back at home ready to do, at first I did more research, and then I was ready to start, and I just took out those 4 sentences, and I just went from there. I was really confusing about how exactly I was supposed to take my research and my ideas and put it into a novel. And so at first I had this green notebook, but it was, I think 150 pages of notes. And what was I going to do with that? I mean, I didn't have that in my head, and I couldn't flip through. And so then I remembered, biographers, real researchers use index cards. So I went to Rite Aid, and I got a big stack of index cards, and I wrote out every single thing in my notebook, and I made a little, topic name on one side of the card, and I wrote down the details on the other. So then I ended up with this big stack cards, which actually I've probably lost. But anyway, I wrote them like that, and then I had my notebook here to write in, and the big sack, and I was like, well, what am I going to do with this? Because still, it just felt strange. It was so different than my process before. So then, a friend of mine told me about Scrivener. Scrivener is a writer's software that you put on your computer, and she said, at least you can do the find. It separates it into different files, different parts of your research will have a heading, and then you can just use the find button and find what you want, which was very useful. So I took all my index cards, I typed every single one up into the computer, and then I had that, and that was okay, but still. The good thing about that, though, by then I had written it all out 3 times. It was really kind of in me, and I didn't have to always be flipping back, and I felt like I could just move forward. And so that's how I started. And what was funny about that was that I really did think that I would try to tell mostly the real story and just fill in what I couldn't find from my research, which was a ton. I mean, there's no dialogue. She says she talked for 36 hours straight, but does she give me one line of dialogue? No. So I have to make it all up. I have to make up, how they get from place to place, who else is there, and of course all of the people that they're studying. And so I start in on the first chapter in her point of view, thinking this is her story, and here we go. And by the end of that chapter, I had changed all their names. I mean, I was calling them Margaret and Rayo and Gregory at first, and then I changed them all, and I kind of had to give myself the freedom to do whatever I wanted. And then I started the second chapter, and that was in my character Andrew Bankson's voice, who was sort of a slight stand-in for Gregory Bateson. And once I wrote that, I was so much closer to that character than I was to Nell, my main character. I was just in his head more. And after I finished that chapter, I realized, this is his story. I'm not telling it from her point of view. It's really his story, and why is he telling it, and what's happening. And as I went on, it became clear to me that he was telling this from a distance, First he was telling it from sort of 1939, and then he got farther and farther, and then pretty soon we were sort of in the 70s, and he was looking back. So he kind of, it had more of a nostalgic feel, really, than I had anticipated at the beginning, and it was sort of, it's more his story than anyone else's, and that was a surprising thing to me. I will say, I'll just warn you if you haven't read the book, that it doesn't end the way real life ends. In real life, they go off, as I said, in different directions. Meade goes back to the United States. Rayo Fortune stays in Australia, and Bankson goes to England. And I just want to say, when we have a question and answer thing, if you have questions about the end, you can come up to me afterwards and we can talk very quietly. But I've been in readings where people raise their hand and say, why did you blah, 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 blah? And people get very, very, very angry, and you could get hurt. So people don't want to be told the end. But I will say about the real life ending, actually, they do that, and then Meade does eventually divorce. She does divorce Rayo Fortune, and she marries Gregory Bateson, and they have a child, and they are married for 12 years. Then he falls in love with someone else, and they get divorced. I didn't think that was the greatest ending for a love story, so I kind of played around with it. But what I wasn't able to include, which I really want to tell you guys about, because it just seems so amazing to me that in 1933, so in May, they left Papua New Guinea and they went to Australia, to Sydney, and they stayed there. And nobody writes about this. You have to dig really hard to find out about this. If you look on the internet or anything, or even in a biography that I just got that was just printed, nothing of this. They went to Sydney, and they needed to figure out this love triangle, and so they all got rooms in this kind of boarding house thing. And first it was Margaret and Rayo on the second floor, and Bateson was on the third floor. But then Margaret moved up to the third floor with Bateson, and then Rayo's old girlfriend Mira came and lived with Rayo on the second floor, and then Bateson's old girlfriend Stevie arrived, and Margaret Mead wrote to her old lover Ruth Benedict and said, Stevie is so inexperienced sexually, we've had to teach her so much. And so I don't know what was going on there in Sydney, but it was way more than I could handle in my novel. Like, it was so much racier than anything I could write about. So I just had to keep it a little, I don't know, a little cleaner, really. But it was I don't know. It's just fascinating to me how it all unfolded, and they really never did figure it out then. And then they kind of all exploded, and they all went off in their different ways, and then finally. I don't know. They worked it out somehow. So I thought that I would read you, a little bit of the first chapter, and then I have a tiny little show and tell thing that I'll do, and then I'm happy to take any questions. So I'll just start it right here. I don't think there's much I have to tell you. I've told you so much already; it'll sound familiar. As they were leaving the Mumbanyo, someone threw something at them. It bobbed a few yards from the stern of the canoe, a pale, brown thing. Another dead baby, Fen said. He had broken her glasses by then, so she didn't know if he was joking. Ahead lay the bright break in the curve of dark green land where the boat would go. She concentrated on that. She did not turn around again. The few Mumbanyo on the beach were singing and beating the death gong for them, but she didn't look at them a last time. Every now and then, when the four rowers, all standing and calling back to their people or out to other canoes, pulled at the same time, a small gust of wind struck her damp skin. Her lesions prickled and tightened, as if hurrying to heal in the brief, dry air. The wind stopped and started, stopped and started. She could feel the gap between sensation and recognition of it, and knew that the fever was coming on again. The rowers ceased rowing to stab a snake-necked turtle and haul it into the boat, still writhing. Behind her, Fen hummed a dirge for the turtle, too low for anyone but her to hear. A motorboat was waiting for them where the Uat met the Sifik. There were two white couples on board with the driver, a man named Minton, whom Fen knew from Carnes. The women wore stiff dresses and silk stockings, the men dinner jackets. They did not complain about the heat, which meant they lived here. The men overseeing either plantations or mines or enforcing the laws that protected them. At least they weren't missionaries. She couldn't have tolerated a missionary today. One woman had bright gold hair, the other eyelashes like black ferns. Both carried beaded purses. The smooth white of their arms looked fake. She wanted to touch the one closer to her, push up her sleeve and see how far up the white went, the way all her tribes, wherever she went, needed to touch her when she first arrived. She saw pity in the women's gazes as she and Fen boarded with their dirty duffels and their malarial eyes. The engine, when it started up, was so loud, so startling, that her hands rose to her ears like a child's. She saw Fen flinch to do the same, and she smiled reflexively, but he did not like that she'd noticed and moved away from her to talk to Minton. She took her seat on the bench at the stern with the women. "What's the occasion?" she asked Tilly, the gold-haired one. If she'd had that hair, the natives never would have stopped touching. You couldn't go into the field with hair like that. They both managed to hear her over the engine and laughed. "It's Christmas Eve, silly." They had been drinking already, though it couldn't have been much past noon, and it would have been easier to be called silly if she hadn't been wearing a filthy cotton shift over Fen's pajamas. She had the lesions, a fresh gash on her hand from a sago palm thorn, a weakness in her right ankle, the old Solomon neuritis in her arms, and an itchy sting between her toes that she hoped wasn't another batch of ringworm. She could normally keep the discomfort at bay while she was working, but it kicked in hard, watching these women in their silks and pearls. "Do you think Lieutenant Boswell will be there?" Tilly asked the other woman. "She thinks he's divine." This one, Eva, was taller, stately, bare-fingered. "I do not, and so do you," Tilly said. "But you are a married woman, my dear." "But you can't expect someone to stop noticing people the minute the ring goes on," Tilly said. "I don't, but your husband certainly does." In her mind, Nell was writing, ornamentation of neck, wrists, fingers, paint on face only, emphasis on lips, dark red, and eyes, black, hips emphasized by cinching of waist, conversation competitive. The valued thing is the man, not having one necessarily, but having the ability to attract one. She couldn't stop herself. Have you been studying the natives? Tilly asked her. No, she's come from the twilight ball at the floating palais. I have, she said, since July. I mean, the July before this last one. A year and a half up that little tributary somewhere? Tilly said. Good God, Eva said. A year first in the mountains north of here with the Anapa, Nell said, and then another 5.5 months with the Mombanyo up the UI. We left early. I didn't like them. Like them, Eva said. I would think keeping your head attached to your neck might be a more reasonable goal. Were they cannibals? It wasn't safe to give them an honest answer. She didn't know who their men were. No, they fully understand and abide by the new laws. They're not new, Eva said. They were issued 4 years ago. I think to an ancient tribe it all feels new, but they obey and blame all their bad luck on the lack of homicide. Did they talk about it? Tilly said. Nell wondered why every white asked about cannibalism. She thought of Fenn when he returned from the 10-day hunt, his sad attempt to keep it from her. I tasted it, he finally blurted out, and you're right, it does taste like old pig. That was her joke. That was a joke the Mombanyo had, that the missionaries had tasted like old pig. They speak of it with great longing. The two women, even long brazen Eva, shrank a bit, and then Tilly asked, did you read the book about the Solomon Islands, where all the children were fornicating in the bushes? Eva, I did. And then Nell couldn't help herself. Did you like it? Oh, I don't know, Tilly said. I don't understand what all the fuss is all about. Is there fuss? Nell said. She'd heard nothing about its reception in Australia. I'll say. She wanted to ask by whom and about what, but one of the men was coming around with an enormous bottle of gin, refilling glasses. Your husband said you wouldn't want any, he said to her apologetically, for he didn't have a glass for her. Fenn had his back to her, but she could see the expression on his face, just from the way he was standing with his back arched and his heels slightly lifted. He would be compensating for his wrinkled clothing and his odd profession with a hard, masculine glare. He would allow himself a small smile only if he himself had made the joke. Fortified by several sips, Tilly continued her inquiry. And what were you right about these tribes? Oh, it's all a jumble in my head still. I never know anything until I get back to my desk in New York. She was aware of her own impulse to compete, to establish dominance over these clean, pretty women by conjuring up a desk in New York. Is that where you're headed now, back to your desk? Her desk, her office, the diagonal window that looked out onto Amsterdam and 118th Street. Distance could feel like a terrible claustrophobia at times. No, we're going to Victoria next to study the Aborigines. Tilly pulled a pout. You poor thing. You look beat up enough as it is. We can tell you all you need to know right now about the Abos, Eva said. It was just this last 5 months, this last tribe. Nell couldn't think of how to describe them. She and Fenn had not agreed on one thing about the Mombanyo. He had stripped her of her opinions. She marveled now at the blankness. Tilly was looking at her with a drunk's depthless concern. Sometimes you just find a culture that breaks your heart, she said finally. Nellie, Fenn called to her. Minton says Bankson is still here. He waved his hand upriver. Of course he is, she thought, but said, the one who stole your butterfly net? She was trying to be playful. He didn't steal anything. What had he said exactly? It had been on the ship coming home from the Solomons, in one of their first conversations. They'd been gossiping about their old professors. Hadn't liked me, Fenn had said, but he gave Bankson his butterfly net. Bankson had ruined their plans. They'd come in 31 to study 2 New Guinea tribes. But because Bankson was on the Sepik River, they'd gone north, up the mountains to the Anapa, with the hope that when they came back down in a year, he'd be gone, and they'd have their pick of the river tribes, whose less isolated cultures were rich with artistic, economic, and spiritual traditions. But he was still there, so they'd gone in the opposite direction from him and the Kiona he studied, down south to a tributary of the Sepik called the Uat, where they'd found the Mombanyo. She had known that tribe was a mistake after the first week, but it took her 5 months to convince Fenn to leave. Fenn stood beside her. We should go and see him. Really? He'd never suggested this before. Why now, when they'd made arrangements for Australia? He'd been with Haddon, Bankson, and the butterfly net in Sydney 4 years ago, and she didn't think they'd liked each other much. Bankson's Keona were warriors, the rulers of the Sepik before the Australian government had cracked down, separating villages, allotting them parcels of land they did not want, throwing resistors in jail. The Mbanyio, fierce warriors themselves, told tales of the Keona's prowess. This was why he wanted to visit Bankson. The tribe was always greener on the other side of the river, she often tried to tell him. But it was impossible not to be envious of other people's people. Until you laid it all out neatly on the page, your own tribe looked a mess. Do you think we'll see him in Angoram? She asked. They could not go traipsing after Bankson. They'd made the decision to go to Australia. Their money wouldn't last much more than half a year, and it would take several weeks to get settled among the Aborigines. Doubt it. I'm sure he steers clear of the government station. The speed of the boat was disorienting. We need to get that pinnace to Port Moresby tomorrow, Frank. The Gunai are a good choice for us. You thought the Mbanyio were a good choice for us, too, when we headed there. He rattled the ice of his empty glass. He looked like he had more to say, but he walked back to Minton and the other men. Been married long? Asked Tilly. 2 years in May, Nell said. We had the ceremony the day before we came out here. Swish honeymoon. They laughed. The bottle of gin came round again. For the next 4.5 hours, Nell watched the dressed-up couples drink, tease, flirt, wound, laugh, apologize, separate, reintegrate. She watched their young, uneasy faces, saw how thin the layer of self-confidence was, how easily it slipped off when they thought no one was looking. Occasionally, Tilly's husband would raise his arm to point out something on land. 2 boys with a net, a quail hanging like a melting sack from a tree, an osprey coasting to its nest, a red parrot mocking their engine. She tried not to think about the villages they were passing, the raised houses and the fire pits and the children hunting for snakes in the thatch with spears. All the people she was missing, the tribes she would never know, and words she would never hear. The worry that they might right now be passing the one people she was meant to study, a people whose genius she would unlock and who would unlock hers, a people who had a way of life that made sense to her. Instead, she watched these Westerners, and she watched Fenn speaking his hard talk to the men, aggressively pressing them about their work, defensively responding when they asked about his, coming to seek her out, then punishing her with a few cutting words and an abrupt retreat. He did this 4 or 5 times, dumping his frustration on her, unaware of his own pattern. He was not through punishing her for wanting to leave the Mbanyio. He's handsome, isn't he, your husband, Eva said when no one else could hear. I bet he cleans up well. So I'll stop there. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. So I thought I would just very quickly show you, just because I write by hand, and so it's easier for me to show you kind of process. And I know my mother-in-law, Harriet, who's a beautiful, beautiful painter, loves to talk about process. So I do too. So I just started. This is the first notebook. I think I went through 3 notebooks to write this novel, the first draft. And this is the first one. And I just started, as I said, with those 4 sentences and kind of just headed out, really feeling like I didn't know what I was doing and that this was never going to turn into a novel, but that I was just going to try. And that's pretty much how I convinced myself to write any novel, is that I'm just going to try and it's probably not going to turn into anything. And then when I get ideas, as I'm writing and figuring things out, maybe I'll get an idea for my next chapter, or somewhere down the line something will happen. And so I always keep blank pages at the end of the notebook, for notes. And the reason I really like writing by hand is that I can write notes in the margin, I can cross things out but still see them, because that's oftentimes the thing you want back but you can't have when you write in a computer. I can draw pictures. Sometimes I need to see things visually. And so, I don't know, I use the margins, I use all the pages. I'm trying to find like a nice picture, but I can't really find it. But and so I can just kind of go all over the place, and I don't know. It's not so polished on the computer. Everything looks polished, even though it isn't polished. And so I like that this looks messy, and I can kind of throw anything down there, and I try to really keep the critical self away, and I just I try to just have the creative self writing in here. And then when I put it on the computer, the critical self can kind of come in and say, okay, keep this, get rid of this, maybe, and it can kind of work with the creative self, but I find the critical self can really shut you down if you let it in too soon. And I for some reason, when I write here, the critic is a little less intimidated or something, or just goes away. And then when I have all these notes, and then when the notes get really chaotic and I can't remember what was I thinking about doing next and what was going to happen next, I usually make a timeline. So this is the timeline for this book. I kind of start at the beginning and then I completely forget my timeline. So I don't really love to read what I have here because a lot of things I didn't do, and it makes me sad when I read it and I think it's a good idea and I realize I didn't ever put it in. But it won't be, it's not, I'm very much type Z, not a type A personality, and so it's not really super organized in terms of chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. They're just small ideas, like he gives her his dead brother's glasses, is one idea. And so I'll be writing toward that. And there's this writer, E.L. Doctorow, who has this great quote about writing, which is, writing is like driving at night. You can only see 3 feet in front of you, but you always get where you're going. And I feel like these are my little 3 feet. I just got one thing ahead and then one thing, and I sort of head to them. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I have to go down another path. But then I do, you do finally get there. Although the very last entry in this timeline says, have some sort of culminating moment. So I didn't really know where I was going, but I knew I had to have a culminating moment. And then the very last thing I do in my notebook is I keep a writing log. I think it comes from years of kind of using punch clocks, working as a waitress. But I need to know when I've written and how long and how much I've written. And so this one started on January 26th of 2011, and I wrote 2 pages. And then the next day, I wrote 4 pages. And the next day, 4, but then 1.5, and then a half page. Sometimes I write like 3 lines, but I keep it, I just try to get to the desk, and how much I write is how much I write, and I try not to beat myself too much up about that. I know that there are writers who say, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write 7 pages, and I'm not getting up until I write 7 pages. But I'm really convinced that they do not have to go pick up their children at 3:15 at school. So I think that's pretty much my dog and pony show. And so I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Or not. Yes.
I think we all want to thank you for taking us into what is the great challenge of writing. Mm-hmm. And as one who's been looking at this for years, I've never heard such a spontaneous, interesting description of how you write a book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. It's really the thing that interests me. I always want to know from other writers, how did you do that? So, yes, right there, back.
Lily, will you share the story that you shared with me when you were a guest author on Invitation Girl Beach about when you were living with your sister, you were in Stonington, and you were in this little shed trying to write the landlord game?
Yes, that's so interesting. Yeah.
I never forgot.
It's so funny. It's really funny because I am writing a novel right now, and that is the first scene. So, but I'm happy to tell the story. It kind of throws him under the bus a little bit. But so I guess when I was writing my first novel, it was 1995, and I was living with I had no plan. I was, for years I really had no plan except to write a book, and so I was always trying to plan a cheap place to live and a restaurant to wait tables at, because that was the only way for me to do it for some reason. Teaching, was another thing that I was kind of qualified to do, pretty much the only other thing I was qualified to do, but that really drains me of all of my writing juju. And so waitressing was a great thing for me to do because I worked at night and I could write all day. I'm kind of a morning writer. And it, it paid the bills if you lived in a really cheap place. And so I was I had moved back to Massachusetts, and my sister took me in. She was living with her boyfriend in a carriage house in Brookline, Mass. And they had a room that they didn't use because it was so small. And there was room enough, it was an old potting shed, and there was room enough for a single futon and a desk. But that's it. Like, you had to step over the futon to get to the desk, and you kind of had to push the futon up a little bit to get the chair of the desk to fit in the room. And so that's where I finished my first novel there. And at first, I think I eventually, when I got a job, I paid rent, but not very much. But when I first moved there, I don't think I paid any rent. And my sister, kind of in exchange, I was desperate to do anything for her. And one of my jobs was to walk her dog. And so I would walk the dog after they left for work. I was supposed to walk the dog to the dog park and hang out and talk to people, but they went off to work, and I took the dog down the driveway, and if he was lucky, up the road and back. Sometimes it was just down the driveway, pee, back in the house. And so one of those points, and I would, I'd been writing for several hours. And one of those mornings, I was coming back, I was in my sweats, my hair's out to here, I'm wearing my old slippers with the stuffing coming out, and I'm walking up the driveway with the dog, and I'm just trying to stay in the zone, the reason I can't go to the dog park is I can't talk to people while I'm in the middle of writing. And so I come up, and it's the landlord, who owns the carriage house and the big house that we all rent from. And he's a lawyer, and he's standing, by his shiny car and his shiny shoes. And he's a nice guy. I really don't mean that he's an awful guy, but it was, he's standing there looking, and he's seeing me. I'm 32 years old. I am single. I live with my sister. I work at a restaurant. I don't seem to have much going for me. And he tries to make a little conversation. And he said, "So, are you still writing a book?" And I said, yeah, I was just writing this morning, but I got to go to work in a couple of hours. And he said, I just think it's extraordinary that you think you have something to say. It was just such a killer thing to hear. It really, really was. And I just remember going back to my little potting shed and my futon and my desk, and being like, well, I don't think I have something to say. I mean, I really don't feel like that's why writers write mostly. I mean, I felt like I was writing to stay sane. It was the one thing that made me feel good about myself was to write every day, and I don't know why, but it had been like that for a long, long time. And then when you write a book, you do realize that you have things to say, but it's not like you come at it with something to say. You just realize that you're saying something. And then you try to say it more clearly in the next draft and the next draft. And then, but I feel like with my first drafts, I'll write it all, and then I'll put it aside for a few weeks, and then I'll read it, and then I'll be like, oh, that's what this is about. That's what I'm trying to say. But I don't know it ahead of time, and so I think that's why I probably told that story. So, thanks. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned this is becoming a feature film.
Yes.
Can you talk about what that experience is like, filming on the creative side,
Yeah. So he's asking about the sort of process and the experience of it being made into a movie. They haven't started filming yet. Early on, a director named Michael Apted, made an offer, and so he had a really great reputation. He's English. He's made all those 7-Up movies, like 7 Up and 14 Up and 21 Up, and that sort of thing, all the way up to 56, I think we are now. And they're sort of documentaries about sociological documentaries about these kids in England. And he also made Coal Miner's Daughter and Girl Is of the Mist, and he has a good reputation. He was head of the Directors Guild at the time, and maybe still is. And great guy. And his wife wanted to be the producer. She was really passionate about the book too. And so I went with them, and they got this wonderful, I think, screenwriter. I did not want to write the screenplay, and they did not offer it to me, thankfully. But they got this guy named David McGee, who's written, I think, 17 adaptations, but one of them is Life of Pi, and the other one was Finding Neverland, which I think is a beautiful, beautiful movie. And so he wrote it very quickly, and they sent it to me, and I loved it, truly loved it, which I didn't expect at all. The first thing I did was when I got that, the first thing I read when I get the screenplay is the first scene, and he's put the very last scene of the novel as the very first scene of the movie. And so I realized, okay, we're in a whole different world here. I was very skeptical, but it worked beautifully. And I wrote him back and I said, more of you and less of me, because he used a lot of my dialogue, and I really liked his dialogue better. Whenever he inserted a little thing, I was like, ooh, that's good. Check. So that was really unexpectedly great. I did not expect to love the screenplay. I thought there were just a gazillion ways in which I would hate it, but I loved it. And so then they got financing. It took a long time to get financing. They got it a few months ago, and now they're in the process of trying to find the actors, and that is not an easy thing to do. So we've been turned down by a few people, and I think right now, I think they wrote me that. I can't even remember her name. I can't even remember her name, who is being offered right now. But I think that I've just been so grateful that I got to give notes about the screenplay, and they've really included me, and they've kept me up to date, and they haven't just kind of shut me out of the whole process, and I've met them several times, and so far so good, but I don't see any filming in sight, so we don't even have any actors, and so I don't know if it will ever happen. I certainly hope it will. They're a very competent group of people, so that's been my experience so far. Yes?
As someone in the trade, I just want to say how remarkably what you did in the novel. Field work is an extraordinary complex and terrifying and unmanageable and waiting and
I can imagine.
confusing. And really, I was astonished at the sensibilities you brought.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That means a lot to me.
May I also just ask how did Mary Catherine Bateson react to the novel?
So she's asking how did Mary Catherine Bateson react to the novel.
She's very proprietary about the novel.
Yes, exactly. She's Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson's daughter, and she's an anthropologist as well. And we were at my publishing house, my editor and I. We were very nervous about what we were going to do. And my editor said, we're going to wait until we get a nice, beautiful hardcover, and then we're going to send it to her. And so I wrote her a very long letter trying to explain what I had done, which was kind of difficult because I couldn't really think about her while I was writing the novel. I had to just be in that world and not worry about what other people were going to say about it, which is, I think, what you always have to do writing a novel. You just have to shut out the world and then figure out what you really want to be published and what you can't publish but wrote in the first draft just to kind of get you there. And then I sent it to her, and she was really lovely. She wrote me back, and she read it immediately and wrote me back and was extremely gracious and wished me a lot of luck with it. And then I had the opportunity, maybe about 6 months ago, to meet her. She lives in New Hampshire. I had an event in New Hampshire, and she came to it, and I brought her up, and it was something she was giving a speech for the same people in a couple of weeks. And so we went to dinner together with other librarians, and then at my event, we invited her to come speak before I spoke, and it was just so fascinating. She's such a smart woman. It was really hard to follow her, I have to say, but she was really, really great. And there was this very intense moment when I was in this position right now, and somebody asked me about whether Margaret Mead had been abused by her second husband, because they're, because of things that happened in the book. And there she was right there, and I was being asked about whether her mother had been abused by her, second husband, and I said, this is what I know, and I listed all of the quotes from letters. She had written Ruth Benedict that at one point when they were in this love triangle situation in Papua New Guinea, that she and Bankson had been very worried because Rao had a gun, and she was worried that he was going to kill Bankson, kill her, and then kill himself. And that, she wrote about several sort of, possible, just fear of him. She had a lot of fear of him. And then she told a friend, I read in the biography, that she told a friend years later that he had caused her a miscarriage. And then she also wrote this fragment of a letter that she never sent him when she was finally leaving Sydney in September and going back. She said, I wouldn't have had to leave you if you hadn't hit me where it showed. And that broke my heart. It just broke my heart on so many levels. And so I said all of that, and then I looked at Mary Catherine and I said, does this correspond with what you know? And she said, absolutely, that's absolutely. And so I was, it was like a trial at that moment, So that was my experience, and she's been really incredible. Any other questions? Yes.
Were you ever able to go to Papua New Guinea to do some research? Because, it's so remote, and to, 1931, a lot of those tribes had never seen a Western.
Exactly.
Were you able to set your scene?
I never went. I didn't ever go. As I said, I had small children. And I'm really not that courageous a traveler anyway. And a terrible travel advisory out, especially Port Moresby, I think is the most dangerous city on the planet. I just read a lot. I tried. There's not a lot. I will just say, not a lot of people have been there. Not a lot of people write about it. It was extremely hard to find books about it. But there are a couple of great books, travel logs, about kind of hiking through the jungle. I just read what I could, and then I took all that information I used about a fraction of it. But I feel like the reader really brings a lot. The reader doesn't understand necessarily that they're bringing their full imagination to it, but I feel like I just give a few details and you all imagine the rest. And for me, I don't like to give too much, like long paragraphs of detail. I just try to give a little tiny bit, and then I really do believe that the reader's imagination fills in the rest, and makes it authentic. It's not really me. Yes.
Two questions. In the film, what is the age range for Margaret? Is it Meryl Streep or Jennifer Lawrence? And others, are you writing a new book now?
So she's asking, what's the age in terms of the actress for the film, and am I writing now? So it's much less. Not Meryl Streep. Definitely more. Jennifer Lawrence, she was their first choice. The minute we got financing, the financiers wanted to go right to Jennifer Lawrence, but she is not available, unsurprisingly. So we're definitely looking for they're looking for late 20s, early 30s. Mead was 31, and I have Nell at about the same age. But it's funny because they said, that they thought that Kate Winslet was maybe too old for I was like, no, fine. I would love Kate Winslet at any age. But I think they are trying to go young, and I think that attracts a younger audience, and that's important for finances as well. And yes, I am working on a new book. It's going. I've had a couple of false starts, and so I'm really kind of at the beginning of something right now. It's going very slowly. Yes.
How old were you when you knew you wanted to be a writer?
How old was I when I knew I wanted to be a writer? I I think that I was 8 years old and I had just read my first Judy Blume novel. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. I read that, and I had loved reading up until then, but I read that and I thought, I want to do that. I want to tell stories about families. And I didn't, we didn't have creative writing when I was in school at all. In grade school, there was no creative writing. I never had one creative writing assignment. But I did have a friend in 5th grade who came in with a notebook, and she said, I'm writing a novel, and she showed it to me. She had 25 pages. And I went home that night and started my own novel. So I think, it was slowly. And then in high school, I had some creative writing classes. Somebody actually taught creative writing for juniors and seniors, and I took that for 2 semesters, and that sort of formed my identity as a writer. I also had, honestly, no other talents. I had nothing else. It wasn't like I had to choose, between being a cellist and being a writer. So, yes.
I have a question. Your creative writing classes. What is your greatest frustration and your greatest reward?
In the creative writing classes that I was taught in high school? Oh, okay. The greatest reward and the greatest challenge? Or is that what you said? Wow. I mean, the greatest reward is just seeing people. I teach a good number of adults. I teach more creative writing like at conferences and sort of shorter, maybe week-long things. And I think it's really just seeing their imaginations turn on, trying to get them, giving them prompts or giving them assignments that really make them feel that they go somewhere unexpected. I mean, I think that's one of the greatest pleasures of writing, is that it brings out something inside you that you didn't even know was there. And I love seeing that in my students, so that's a great reward. And then in terms of the challenges, it's really, really getting that critical self out of the room. I think school, kind of traditional school, the sense of right and wrong, I think we've all been trained for success in certain ways, and that's not how you kind of get success in the creative process. You have to take big risks and be willing to fail and not worry that you're doing it badly, and not listening to that voice in your head that says this isn't how you're supposed to do it. And that's the biggest challenge, is really talking to them about that, getting them to identify when it's happening as they're writing, and then stopping that. And that's real muscle memory. I mean, we've learned it for so many years, and to stop that from happening takes a while. It still takes me, it's still a challenge for me, I'm trying to do this for so many years. Now I know, I'm so sorry, the balcony, I've ignored you.
That was my question, which is, when you have been derailed or hobbled by the inner critic over the years, what specific things, what do you do, who do you go to, what has been your method of battling that, or what do you have to say about that in the process?
I know, it's a great question, it's a big challenge. Normally, if I'm really, stuck in some way or feeling very low about my own abilities or writing in general, I usually just stop and I start reading. I find that, for me, writing in my journal and reading really helps. And when I read, in that way, I will do it in my writing time, like in the morning, with a cup of tea and with a pencil and paper nearby. And so I'll be taking notes, and it's kind of like a creative way of reading. And I really only read fiction. Nonfiction doesn't inspire me in that way. Although, of course, that biography of Margaret Mead definitely inspired me, I suppose. And that usually loosens things up. But I think the most important thing is not for me to put any pressure on myself. I don't write books very quickly. I've kind of traditionally written them between 4 and 6 years apart, and I have no idea why. I look back in there, and why did that take me so long? I have no idea. Probably because I was being really nice to myself and not like pressuring myself when I didn't feel like it. I try every day, especially, every day that my kids are in school. But I think sometimes it just doesn't come, and then I have to replenish. I actually had a therapist once because I was in such a difficult spot, kind of trying to figure out the mother-writer balance as well as kind of being stuck in a novel. And she said, it was so clear to her I had to replenish. And so then I call that, and sometimes it'll be 2 or 3 weeks that I'll just be replenishing. And that feels really, really good. Yes? What are the last couple of books I've read? So, I just read the second book of Karl Ove Knausgaard. Has anybody read him? I read the first one, and I thought, I don't know if I need to read another one of those. There are 6 of them, although only 5 of them have been published, I think, or maybe even 4 of them have been published here. He's a Norwegian writer. He writes very, very, very autobiographically, with sort of a bizarre, freaky, photographic memory of everything. And the first one is about his father's death and being a teenager and being a young adult, and maybe a little bit more than a young adult, a little older. But then the second one is all about being a father, a writer, and a husband, and it is just so engaging for me as a writer, and he just is so honest, and he's gotten in a lot of trouble with a lot of people because he doesn't change anybody's name, and he really tells the truth. He just will be happy to tell your secrets, right on the page, and you can't believe he's going to his daughter's birthday party and he's writing all these things about the parents, like, all these rules that you learn as a writer never to do. He's breaking them all, but it's so intriguing and sort of exhilarating in that way because he's breaking those rules. So I loved that book too, and he also just writes about being a writer and about going to readings like this, and I don't know, it's so intimate and was intriguing to me. And right now, I read Elena Ferrante's, which is kind of a companion thing almost to Karl Ove. Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend quartet. And I really liked that, but right now I'm reading her first novel, Days of Abandonment, and it is phenomenal. It's very small. And here she wrote this huge opus, and now this book is very small and so good and just such a page turner. It's about a woman absolutely breaking down after her husband leaves her for a younger woman, and it's so raw and so honest, and I just love it, and I just can't wait to get back and read it tonight. So, are we done? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lily. That was wonderful. And thank you all for coming this afternoon, I should say. And our next talk, put this on your calendars, it will be here at the LaGrua Center on Sunday, August 14th at 5 o'clock. And it'll be Stone Roberts will talk about his journey as an artist and as a painter. And I think many of you know him. It should be a wonderful program. So we look forward to seeing you then, and have a wonderful rest of the summer. And books are available in the back, and Lily will be happy to sign them for you. Thank you very much.